From Microsoft's perspective, before we get broader, is it opening up a Pandora's box here in terms of regulatory oversight?
Yes, absolutely. So Microsoft was one of the few companies that didn't have their feet held over the fire in the recent congressional hearings. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they don't have social media properties and this exposure to misinformation and disinformation campaigns that we see in companies like Facebook. So it's really a significant liability that they would be taking on. On the other hand, though, they would potentially be accessing a huge youth market.
Yeah, and so maybe the upside for them they see is weighed greater than the downside. I'm interested in your take on, say, hypothetically, Microsoft decides it's not going to go for TikTok. What then, in terms of the regulatory oversight, the ability of President Trump to actually ban the app?
This is, I think, really the crucial question that all of us need to be asking, because the US government doesn't have any capacity to force a sale of TikTok or to force Microsoft to acquire the US operations or other operations. So essentially, by setting up these executive orders, President Trump was creating a dynamic where if this sale doesn't go through, millions and millions of users in the US are going to have to operate in a great firewall like situation where they would be illegally using TikTok. We don't have the infrastructure to enforce bans of specific software. Obviously, the financial bans could move forward, but getting teens and grandparents off of TikTok during the quarantine is going to be a nearly impossible technical task.
Did you say grandparents? I like that
Yeah,
idea.
well, I mean, this is the thing about TikTok, the teens and the grandparents doing dance challenges together. This is part of why it's popular.
And their dogs and chickens and goodness knows what other type of animal you might have. And I'm interested, what do you see when you look around the world? Because we have known that India's already gone here, right? Not only TikTok,
Right.
but many Chinese apps have been banned by that country. How are they doing it, if at all?
Well, I mean, India has a much more heavily regulated internet landscape. So there is a capacity to ban specific apps there. But what we're seeing right now is actually Australia is discussing the possibility of TikTok divestment, as is New Zealand, as is Canada. So this is really, in many ways, uncharted territory to see these countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States start to think about, are there apps that we're going to ban people from using? And frankly, it's the sort of thing that requires long-term strategic and systemic thinking rather than executive orders by fiat.
Give us your long-term perspective in strategic thinking, the application of your brain that you do towards the project that you're working on at the moment. I understand it's about data trafficking in particular between the US and China. And we forget, amid all the headlines of whether or not the US government takes a cut from Microsoft buying TikTok or whether or not it can be done, is also whether or not it should be done. From your analysis, does TikTok take too much data in comparison to what Facebook does and Google does? Is there a real threat here that that Beijing does indeed have more on us than we realize?
Yeah, so there is a threat as it relates to Beijing and as it relates to the type of data that is being exfiltrated to China through apps like TikTok. But there are also risks with other apps and with other consumer platforms that are operating in the US that haven't drawn ire. What I argue is that it's really important for the US to be regulating how consumer data is being stored and how consumer data is being stored and shared and integrated, not just for Chinese firms, but for US firms as well. And that gets to a lot of the problems that we see with Facebook and with Google. They're not always using our data responsibly either.